Whatever may be the future of our freedom vessels, of course, because of the generation of people who are like you. Only on this basis can the peace of Africa and the world be firmly founded. Our cause is because of equality between nations and nations. Only thus can the brotherhood of men be firmly established. It is encouraging and elating to remind you that despite the humiliation and torment at the hands of white rule, the spirit of Africa in the quest for freedom has been generated for peaceful means to the utmost. In bringing my address to a close, let me invite Africa to cast their eyes beyond the past and to some extent the present, with their woes and tribulations, trials and failures, and some success, and see herself as an emerging continent bursting to freedom through the shell of centuries of self. This is Africa's day, the dawn of her spring. Yes, the moment when she must grapple with destiny to reach summits of sublimity, say, ours was a fight for noble values and worthy ends, and not for land and enslavement of men.
Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki, the former President of the Republic of South Africa, who was also the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, as well as, of course, the First Lady of Namibia, who will be our main speaker this evening, and welcome them to this event. Thank you. You may be seated. Welcome to the 4th Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair Founders Lecture for 2022. My name is Eusebius McKaiser. That's also the first time I've seen my name signed. I will be the moderator this evening and your host. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm a South African writer, political analyst, and a broadcaster. We have an amazing presence of human beings, both online and with us physically in this hybrid event. And I'd like to acknowledge just some of the many absolutely fascinating guests we have this evening. His Excellency, Dr. Thabo Mbeki, the former President of the country, as well as the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Professor Puleng Lenkabula, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, as well as other members of the university executive and the extended management who's present with us. Your Excellencies, the ambassadors who are always very supportive of the events. Many of you are recognized from last year's event as well, and some of the high commissioners who are representing various countries here in South Africa. Members of the University Council are present with us. Of course, our esteemed guest speaker, I have a lot more to say about her, Madam Monica Gengos, who's the First Lady of the Republic of Namibia. It is an absolute pleasure to see you. Mr. Important Mkhize, the Chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, and other members of the Luthuli Museum. The Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. Masondo, is also with us, as well as the Deputy Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Ms. Nkadi Meng, and various other members of government departments, Dr. Bum, the chairperson of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Mr. Luthuli, and other members of the Chief Albert Luthuli family present here tonight. It's fantastic to see you again. Delegation from the University of Nigeria, dignitaries from the national, provincial, and local government, and friends of the University of South Africa attending this lecture, and of course, someone who's been working extremely hard, deceptively calm, but very hard-working, Professor. A symposium, and it would have been a wonderful event. Over the next hour and a half, 2 hours, we probably won't do justice to the political and the intellectual minutiae of what you're about to experience. So your patience will be richly rewarded. Secondly, I say this at my peril. I do have two colleagues that are working with me. They are our sign language interpreters, Ms. Sophie Mabaso, and online Ms. Winnie Ngobeni. And I'm delighted so we can reach more persons and be less exclusionary as we usually are with our unacknowledged ableism. But if you are a speaker, please don't speak too fast. I'm probably speaking about as fast as is helpful. I just don't want you to be too self-conscious. You don't want to be too slow, but also just be mindful that you're not speaking too fast so that they're able to interpret at a pace that is reasonable so that many more people can hear. This event is absolutely amazing. I'm not going to say much until a little bit later, beyond the fact that when I hosted it last year, I had one thought, and I will intersperse the evening with little bits of thoughts here and there. That's what happens when you get a political analyst to be the MC. That Chief Albert Luthuli is an underrated South African hero. And in a sense, an event like this should be broadcast on the SABC. It should be a public event with millions of eyeballs and eardrums that are listening to this evening as we do, for example, the Nelson Mandela lecture every single year. And that's important. The academics in the room will use big words like epistemicide, which is complicated English for knowledge that has been obliterated very often by the Europeans that don't want to acknowledge black thought, black heroes. Sometimes we do it to our own. And it saddens me to say that if we were to go to Sandton City or even a mall in the township and ask the average South African, who is Albert Luthuli, you might get an answer like a rap star. That is the kind of gap in public knowledge about important historical figures we have a duty to make sure we close. And for me, this lecture is exciting because it speaks into that project of epistemic justice. With that said, I would like to formally invite to the podium someone who is very important in the leadership of the university, the Principal and Vice Chancellor. Can we put our hands together and welcome Prof. Puleng Lenka Pula.
Molweni, sanibonani, watuke. You don't know waluke or watuke? How do you receive your guests? Lochani, khotong, salam alaikum. Thank you. Program Director, Mr. Eusebius Makaiser, thank you very much for inviting me. I also want to acknowledge your co-participant in leading the process, Ms. Sophie Mabaso from our Advocacy Resources Center for students living with disabilities and for expressing a language that oftentimes is forgotten. So I'm appreciative that you're here to support this process. Let me first acknowledge the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki, the former President of South Africa, and our Chancellor. Thank you. Let me also recognize our own keynote speaker for this evening event, Madam Monica Gengos, the First Lady of the Republic of Namibia, a lawyer and a business person. I also want to recognize Dr. David Masondo, our Deputy Minister of Finance, as well as our Deputy Minister of Finance, and actually a person who has trained many student leaders in many universities on thinking around their agency as citizens in our country. So I think we would like to acknowledge you, not only for the finances, but also for being central to the formation of youth and young adults as leaders. I'm delighted to also acknowledge the presence of Ms. Tembing Gadimeng, the Deputy Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and other members of various government departments. Let me recognize Dr. Brigalia Bam, Chairperson of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the former Chairperson of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Mr. Nkululeko Luthuli, and other members of the Chief Albert Luthuli family, dignitaries from national, provincial, local government, diplomatic corps present, friends of the University of South Africa attending this event in person and virtually, members of Council of the University of South Africa and members of extended management, ambassadors, as I've said, the Mr. Mkize, Chairperson of Luthuli Museum, Council, members of the museum, the students, you're welcome to UNISA, and we hope you can already imagine your future. This event could not have been also interesting without the people who are going to listen deeply to the presentation of our keynote, and the organizer, one who has also been at the center of this particular lecture, Professor Puleng Sekgalo, Professor Simpiwa Sisanti, Professor of Faculty of Education, as one of the panel discussants, Professor Lebuile Muletsane, Professor and John Langalibalele Dube, Chair in Rural Education in the School of Education and Vice Chancellor, Social Cohesion at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Fundiswa Kubo, Professor in the Department of Christian Spirituality, Church History, and Missiology. I'm also told that it's very important for us to recognize Positive Vibrations Foundation, the Creative Art Performance, and other representatives. I often share with colleagues in the university that sometimes we want to gloss over the protocols, but I'm unable to do so. Good evening. Good evening. I'm happy, at least I know we are all together. I'm truly privileged to welcome you to the University of South Africa. We often call it the University of the Land, the university that is at the center of science diplomacy in our country and in the continent. I'm appreciative especially to welcome you to the 4th Annual Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair Founders Lecture. Professor Sekgalo, we truly appreciate the initiative and really ensconcing yourself within the dynamism of thinking around our leaders, forebears, who participated in the imagination of liberation and freedom in our country and in the world. I wish to thank the Luthuli Museum as well and its council for the profound generosity and partnership in the flagship annual lecture in honor of one of the illustrious sons of Africa, Chief Albert Luthuli, a leader of the African National Congress, one of the longest liberation movements in the continent, whose history and future must at all times be looking into its role in society in a humanizing system. I wish to recognize that Chief Albert Luthuli not only created an opportunity for us to reflecting around leadership, freedom, around moral agency, and the idea of violence, systemic, structural, individual, including gender justice. But he also asked the questions around how such liberation movements, but also the imagination of the future, ought to be engendering the idea of peace with justice, the idea of ensuring that the voices of youth and young adults, but also the voices of others in their lives are not trampled upon. I think this is a great testament that when done well, leadership produces institutions and individuals that help us to think around how we contribute to enduring legacies across time and space, but across this ideal of ensuring that knowledge becomes a partner to the changes that society imagines, as well as not just in theorization, but also in action. I think the celebration or commemoration of Chief Albert Luthuli is a reminder to all of us that leadership is a serious spiritual, moral, ideational, practical, but it's also an economic and ecological issue that the current generation of leaders must not take for granted. That we are contending with climatic changes, ecological degradation. The experiences of KwaZulu-Natal should be an eye-opener on how we should be at the center of thinking about this future and the history of our people, including their future imaginations. The University of South Africa aligns itself with the life and work of Albert Luthuli and the monuments established in his honor as it celebrates the continuing efforts at agitating for freedom, liberation, but also humanizing dignified humanity. At UNISA, we strive to become a Pan-African university that shapes futures, that ensures that humanity is not just thinking about itself, but also equally the cosmos or ecology, as I've also stated. We carry out this vision through our teaching and learning research, engaged scholarship work, and we believe that it constitutes the core mandate of the university, not only to our students, but we have a public duty to ensure that knowledge, especially through engaged scholarship and our research, innovations, products, processes, changes lives and for the better. In his 1961 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, Chief Luthuli makes a cogent argument, but also invitation. He says scientific inventions at all conceivable levels must enrich human life, not threaten existence. Science should be the greatest ally, not the worst enemy of humankind. Only so that the world can only respond to the efforts of people and ensure the world from self-destruction. He said, in our contribution to peace, we are resolved to end such evils as oppression, white supremacy, race discrimination, and all forms of violence, all of which are incompatible with world peace and security. Our university truly believes in the vision, values, and leadership of Chief Albert Luthuli and all that he represented. However, as a university, we always invite contestations, analysis, in order that even as we draw on some of the lessons, we do not just follow without reasonable rationality. Like him, we believe that scientific inventions at all conceivable levels should enrich human lives, not threaten it. And this is a commitment of UNISA. Science should be the greatest ally, not the worst enemy of humankind. On this occasion of the 4th annual lecture, we mark the 61 years since Chief Luthuli received the Nobel Peace Prize and exactly 124 since his birth and 55 years since his death. All of these are key milestones in the memory and legacy of Chief Albert Luthuli, as well as the African National Congress and the continent and Zimbabwe and South Africa, from which he derived his descent. Although he never saw a free Zimbabwe or free South Africa, Chief Luthuli lived to see the birth of the Continental Pan-African Unity Organization, the Organization of African Unity, which I'm truly delighted that our Chancellor contributed to its transformation into what is now called the African Union, which is quite at the center of multilateralism, but also bringing our horizons as Africans to really harness the cohesion, but also the talents, expertise, our dreams for the future, and how we can collectively reimagine our histories in the 21st century. That history is the history of people whose civilizations were rudely and violently disrupted. The program director referred to it as epistemic violence to the knowledge systems of Africa, its civilizations, but also its icons of freedom, and has put them in the back burner. Today, Madam Gengos, the First Lady of the Republic of Namibia, we are honored by your presence, that you have agreed to come and address us to celebrate this iconic leader of freedom who was not just shared by South Africa and Zimbabwe, but by the continent and the global world. As you may have seen, colleagues, Her Excellency, our First Lady, has a large portfolio of public service in Namibia and the continent and the world. Her passion and commitment to Africa, women emancipation, economic development, and the fight against gender-based violence, sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, and all other forms of discrimination is a matter of public record and finds resonance with some of the issues that our own celebrant, Chief Albert Luthuli, resonated with. We're truly delighted and very appreciative that you have made time to join us. I particularly like that, Madam Gengos, that you refuse to be silenced in a world that reduces women and girl children to invisibility. I'm aware that sometimes you have been asked to hush it, keep quiet, be silent. Why are you speaking out? On the same subject of invisibility, violence, patriarchy, I am appreciative that in many of your talks, written work, you have stated that you think patriarchy, and I want to quote you, I think patriarchy is a pyramid scheme which relies on the silence of women because without their silence, they can't get more recruits. As women, when we speak out on these issues of patriarchy, sexual, gender-based violence and femicide, the economic participation of women, oppression, their muted voices, there's always backlash. You said, as the First Lady, you've been told that there are important things to talk about other than these, and that you should be ashamed of talking about issues that annoy the mainstream. And I'm happy in your talk you have said you are not going to be silenced. You will speak about gender-based violence as you will talk about economic transformation of your society and the continent. And I think this is an important contribution, especially for you young girls. Many women here and across the world identify with your message. Our attitude is clear. We need to agitate and co-construct better world free of patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, economic and ecological injustices of any forms in celebrating iconic leaders such as Chief Luthuli. We need to create free and inclusive societies as espoused by our leader, Chief Albert Luthuli. Once more, on behalf of our Chancellor, our council chairperson, the management of the university, its primary stakeholders, the students of the University of South Africa, its alumni, academics, administrative, and professional staff. We wish to appreciate your presence and welcome you, and welcome all our guests to this important event. Welcome to the University of South Africa, the University of the Land, the home for leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Characteristically reflective. Someone earlier didn't expect the former president here, President Mbeki, and almost got the shock of their life when he walked past them and exclaimed loudly next to me, "Oh, I didn't expect I'm an African to be here." Next, we're going to have Positive Vibrations Foundation. They're going to be doing a creative performance, and I'm really looking forward to that. And these are primary and high school learners from Davidton in Ekurhuleni. I feel conflicted because on the one hand, it is wonderful to see excellence full stop, and particularly, unashamedly fantastic to see black excellence, black women excellence. But the reason I'm conflicted is that I also, as I am enjoying the creative excellence of the young people, I'm thinking to myself, if we truly had peace and security, we shouldn't have children understand the grammar of violence. They shouldn't have to be fluent in the politics of fighting gender inequity. And so the real vision is seeing them again in a different universe where their creativity, like that of boys, can be to celebrate the everyday, that which is banal, to talk about the daffodils outside, and not have to be politically fluent as young people. So let's give them a wry round of applause. With that said, I'd like to welcome to the stage the grandson of Chief Albert Luthuli, Mr. Nkululeko Luthuli.
Program directors, our hosts this evening, the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Dr. Mbeki, together with the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Dr. Puleng Lengapula, our guest of honor and keynote speaker, Mrs. Monica Gengos, the First Lady of Namibia, ministers present here today, deputy ministers, members of government, Professor Mkhize, the chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council, as well as council members present today, UNISA members of council, Senate and academic staff, members of our diplomatic corps and foreign representatives, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, our students and scholars who have just given us this wonderful rendition. Good evening on this beautiful African evening. My task today is that of a very simple one tonight, and that is to thank the University of South Africa for its ongoing commitment to the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair and the meaningful strides that the work it does has and continues to have on our communities and our continent. Equally so, the family is grateful to be honored by the First Lady of our country neighbor, Namibia. It is a well-known fact that Namibia was a fond ally of the African National Congress during the times of liberation struggle, and those relations continue to be so in a now emancipated South Africa. This year's theme, which is Women, Peace and Security, particularly the women's role towards a global peace agenda, is one that I believe should form the architecture of all public policy formulation, corporate and private vision and mission statements, as well as our public discourse. This is because, and I need not dwell on these facts, women, particularly in Africa and so-called developing countries, make up the majority of not only our population, but also our economic activity. I am certain that much of the dialogue tonight will go deeper into the societal impact that women have on our world. So let me perhaps bring this theme closer to home by way of a role and impact that my grandmother, Unobukhanya Luthuli, had on our family and the community of Groudville. Oftentimes, this event reflects, as the Vice-Chancellor has, on the legacy of Chief Luthuli. I am therefore glad that this year's theme affords the opportunity to put a small spotlight on Chief Albert Luthuli's life partner and anchor, uMabengu, as we fondly call her, and as she is fondly known in the community of Groundville. When Chief Luthuli accepted chieftaincy of Abakolwa in the Mvoti Missionary Reserve, that decision simultaneously changed the course of Nogokhanya's Luthuli's life as well. Mabengu, who was a qualified teacher and destined for a cushy life of teaching, became an unemployed wife of a freedom fighter. And it goes without saying that in those days, this was not a life of comfort and glamour. Together with my grandfather's traditional role and political exorcism, this meant that my grandmother was in the front lines of community issues and realities, because oftentimes my grandfather would be under house arrest, or not at home. It was when faced with these hardships that much of Mabengu's lifelong work and involvement in the community of Groundville came to the fore. And in response to these hardships, I will mention but a few of her initiatives. She established numerous farming initiatives and co-ops together with the women of Groundville, some of which still stand today, albeit under a different guise. She continued teaching informally, particularly to those who were illiterate. There was a post office at my grandmother's place, and so people would come and collect their post, but they could not read the post. And Mabengu used this as an opportunity to teach them how to read. And lastly, she was an organizer of several women's groupings and formations through the Church of Groundville. I would also like to believe that she greatly influenced the ANC's policy on the inclusion and ascension of women in the ANC leadership, because she had the president's ear. And it is, I would like to believe, no wonder that we saw the great stride of women within the African National Congress from the 50s onwards. These are just some of the ways that an educated woman, mother and wife, was able to contribute and uplift her community in those days. And it was in no small part this contribution of her works that made Groundville a thriving, developed, and a peaceful community. And it remains so until today. Program Director, I wish to conclude by drawing from a book I recently read by the former CEO and chairperson of PepsiCo, Mrs. Indra Nooyi, and the first female chairperson and CEO of PepsiCo of immigrant descent. In her book, she asserts, and I paraphrase here, that increasing women's participation in economic activity grows economies. That women inclusion in leadership position creates more stable organization and brings about alternative thought consideration to those organizations. That a practical balance between work and time for family for women ensures healthier and more wholesome families. In my own line of work, I see Indra's assertions on a daily basis. Much of South Africa's informal economy is driven by women. And by informal economy, I by no means mean that this is a small economy. It is indeed very large. Many small businesses and community-based organizations are women-led. And we see the impact of these organizations in bringing stability to those communities. However, this needs to reflect same in larger public sectors and corporate spheres. With those words, and on behalf of the Luthuli family, I wish to thank the University of South Africa, all the stakeholders of the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair and this event, as well as our guest of honor, Mrs. Monica Gengos. Ngiyabonga.
Thank you, Nkululeko, and especially thank you for speaking to your allotted time. That is very un-South African, and I appreciate that as program director. The next person I'd like to call to the podium is Mr. Mkhize, who is the chairperson of the Luthuli Museum Council. If we can please welcome him to this event.
Program Director, Eusebius Makaiza, President, Dr. Thabo Mbeki, the University Chancellor, Professor Uleng, Lenkabula, UNISA, Principal and Vice Chancellor, UNISA Council, and UNISA Executive Management. Dr. David Masondo, and other ministers present here. Our keynote address speaker, an honorable guest, Mrs. Monica Gengos, First Lady of the Republic of Namibia. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, Professor Puleng Sekgalo, Chairperson of UNISA, Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair, Professor Simpiwe Sesanti, Professor Nkondo, Professor Relebohile Moletsane, Professor Fundiswa Kobo, Mr. Nkululeko Luthuli, representing the Luthuli family, UNISA management and staff, UNISA council members and management, invited guests joining us here at the KZN Matthews Hall, learners and students that have just provided a superb, beautiful rendition. We thank you. Viewers joining us through virtual, comrades, friends, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocols observed. Good evening. My name is Important Mkhize, the chairperson of Luthuli Museum Council. In the words of Chief Albert Luthuli, women of all races have had far less hesitation than men in making common cause about things basic to them. Quote, unquote. One of the things Mr. Luthuli valued about his wife, Mrs. Nogukanya Luthuli, was her integrity, which expressed herself in everything that she did, from her steadfast reliance on God, her devotion to Him as her husband and their family, right down to such things as paying their accounts without delay. How benefiting is tonight's theme on the 4th annual Chief Albert Luthuli Founders Lecture with a woman who not only reminds us of Uma Bengu, Mrs. Nokukanya Luthuli, Chief Albert Luthuli's wife, with the many titles held by our keynote speaker today, and the many achievements as a woman in Africa. It is heartwarming to know that there are women with a similar spirit of Mrs. Nokukanya Luthuli in our continent. Mr. and Mrs. Luthuli are probably looking down with such joy to know that their work was not in vain. Today we host a lecture named after a man who fought for non-racialism, non-violence, liberation of our country and Africa, a leader and a man of ambition. Mapengu was active in the community and even set up a post office at her home for all Groudville residents. That interaction between the community and the family, the Luthuli family, that nexus. She rallied the women of Groudville and led a movement for the establishment of a local clinic. She was also a founding member of the Groudville brand of Daughters of Africa. Even more, Mrs. Luthuli was part of the delegation to the then Zulu king to complain about the extension of passes to women. Chief Luthuli was a proponent of nonviolence. He embraced relationality, gender justice, and interaction. In 1961, Luthuli was awarded the 1960 Nobel Peace Prize for the role leading to the nonviolent anti-apartheid movement. Luthuli's supporters branded him as a global icon of peace, similar to Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and the latter of which, Martin Luther King, to be a follower and admirer of Ubaba Luthuli. While remembering Chief Albert Luthuli, this year's lecture speaks to the broader continental issues. In the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, which over 2 years ago has seen an escalation in humanitarian crisis threatening the health, safety, and well-being of communities the world over. Extreme poverty, food insecurity, man-made conflict, and disasters, including political violence, wars, and social unrest, have had an extensive impact on the physical, mental, and social well-being of the multitudes of individuals affected. Many new threats have emerged in the form of violent extremism, climate change, human trafficking, as well as global protracted refugee crisis. It is during such tumultuous times that those at risk, the vulnerable members of society, most often women and girls, receive significantly decreased amount of attention in response to ensuring humanitarian disaster. As the theme seeks to address women worldwide, are leaders of movements for reconciliation and reconstruction in their communities. As peacekeepers, relief workers, and mediators. The United Nations has recognized the central role women play in their families and communities' well-being and has committed to promoting women, peace, security for almost 20 years. Indeed, the United Nations Security Council resolution on women, peace and security, or WPS, was passed in 2000 on the basis of evidence suggesting that women's participation in peace processes contributes to longer, more resilient peace after conflict. Yet, despite this, women remain largely invisible too and excluded from peace processes and negotiations. Feminists and women's rights activists have rightly stated that it is impossible to build inclusive peace when women's experiences are absent from the responses to conflict. The Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair is an extension of ensuring that the legacy of Chief Albert Luthuli is kept alive. The partnership between the Luthuli Museum and UNISA is not one that we take lightly, but one that holds significance in the upliftment of the great giant which is Chief Albert Luthuli, that we represent as the Council and Management of Staff of Luthuli Museum. We thank Professor Sekgalo and her team for her unending support of the legacy and memory of Chief Albert Luthuli. We look forward to continuous working with the research chair in UNISA for many years to come. We look forward, Madam, the keynote address for tonight and further discussions by the discussion panel. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Mkhize. I would like to invite next Professor Puleng Sekgalo, who's going to give us a context to this research chair lecture. But before she does so, just want to say a little bit about her. She's an excellent academic and researcher in her own right, someone who has many awards for the quality of her research, starting from when she was a student, and as one does, managing to graduate with double distinction, a doctorate that focused on social and personality psychology, and she's got a deep interest in trauma and suffering. You're not going to suffer through her talk, though. She's a very competent speaker, and what is particularly exciting about her is that if we stereotype psychology, psychologists often focus on the individual, and most of her work is on psychology applied to the communities. For example, how we respond to HIV and AIDS within our communities. So she's got a deep interest in what psychology as a discipline can do at a societal level rather than the stereotype of lying on the couch and speaking in one-on-one context. Can we please welcome her to the podium?
Thank you, Mr. Mkhize, program directors, our Chancellor, His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki, Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Puleng Lenkabula, Mr. Important Mkhize, the Chairperson of the Luthuli Museum, our Deputy Ministers, Minister Nkadiming and Minister Masondo, our guest of honor, Madam Monica Gainkos, distinguished guests, members of the diplomatic corps, friends, family, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. At the very first lecture, the founder's lecture, Professor Mushe Ngondo put up a challenge, and he reminded us that Inkosi Albert Luthuli was a man of the people. His work was embedded within the community. And so, Prof. Ngondo, I took up that challenge. And in that challenge, I also respond to something that Dr. Masondo, our Deputy Minister, also said, that academics, we're full of theories and we theorize, but we don't move beyond the theorization. And I would like to say, Deputy Minister, with the positive vibrations today, that was part of us putting theory into action. When we speak about feminist imaginations, feminist epistemologies, this is what it looks like. I've had the honor to partner and work with Positive Vibrations for about a year now. And the dramatization that you see is actually based on the theoretical work that we do at the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair. I would like to acknowledge Ms. Lungile Magagula and Ubud Snethemba Janji, who are both here, that I've been working very closely with. They are the coordinators, and Mam Lungile is one of the teachers. The learners that you see here are actually from Davidton, from the Chief Albert Luthuli Primary School, but also the high school also in Davidton as well. The Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair serves as a platform for critical engagement and debates that aim at advancing positive social change here at home in Africa and abroad. With this annual lecture, we aim at centering the legacy of Inkosi Luthuli. We do this by paying attention to issues that he was consistently preoccupied with. Issues such as gender justice, which we're focusing on tonight, poverty, various forms of inequality, unemployment, and the upholding of human rights. Furthermore, with this lecture, we hope to develop an institutionalized and inclusive social epistemology and to provide a horizontal institutional link between the networks of knowledge agencies within the continent and beyond. I would like to invoke the spirit of Ubaba and call him to this room by quoting him. In his book, Let My People Go, he said the following, and I quote, "Our women have never been treated by us as inferiors. It is the whites misunderstanding the laws and customs by which we formerly governed ourselves who have done this. Having no ready-made laws in their own society to meet the needs of us Africans, they have declared that our women are legally minors throughout their lives. This does not reflect the situation as seen through African eyes. And as we speak about decolonization and Africanization, this is what we're talking about. The question which we men," and here he was challenging the African men, "who lead the movement and who see the suffering of our women, ask ourselves is this: just how long can our women be expected to keep within bounds their indignation?" An indigenous scholar, Vanessa Pizingili, in some ways echoes what Ubab Luthuli says in her assertion that prior to colonization, many indigenous societies were non-hierarchical and gender equitable. Many were matriarchal, actually. Women were powerful and revered for their spiritual connection with the land. However, colonization severed indigenous women's land-body connection because colonialism depended on the domination of indigenous women's bodies and the land. The introduction of racist and gendered legislation by the colonial government solidified this domination. Today, our statistics show that women are often excluded from formal peace negotiations, which is inconsistent with the augmented impacts of war and conflict on women and girls. Researchers and scholars who have interrogated the WPS Women in Peace Security state that resilience and peace building is most successful in supporting individuals, societies, and states to better absorb and cope with the challenges of violent conflicts. In Africa, the African Development Community, or SADC, has highlighted the meaningful participation of women as active agents in the peace and security process, leading not only through policy, but in practice as well. And often because many of the women do the work at grassroots level, it's not perceived or looked at as policy issues, but just the everyday. But it is important that we acknowledge the importance of the everyday. Having said this, there continues to be less attention and efforts to respond to the everyday violence that women face. In some ways, there is failure to recognize that women's safety in their homes, the workplaces, the streets is also an issue of peace and security. Luthuli constructs women as formidable enemies to the then oppressive state. He further valorizes and cements women's roles in the liberation struggle and concludes that, I quote, had the women hung back, resistance would still have been faltering and uncertain, unquote. One may interpret Luthuli's statement as saying that in decentering and silencing women's roles and involvement in movements for social justice, peace and solidarity, the efforts of such movements are less likely to bear fruit. There is indeed a threat to peace as women's lives continue to be deemed disposable, with gender-based violence threatening the stability of families and, by extension, our society as well. Psychology scholar Nhlanhla Mkhize reminds us that we need to be careful of how language is used. For example, the saying, "a woman's place is in the kitchen," is not in line with African cosmology. In African cosmology, we say a woman is a fireplace. She is fierce, she is powerful, she brings warmth to those around her, and she's ready to spit fire when the situation calls for it. African women warriors such as Nanaya Asantewa in Ghana is one such example. We also have the Women Army of the Kingdom of Dahomey in Benin, and a woman warrior, Queen Amina of Zaria in Nigeria. These are a few of the many women warriors here in Africa. How many of us know of them? By blindly accepting and adopting Eurocentric notions of gender, we run the risk of imposing problematic understanding of gender relations. May we remember our history. May we remember the power of women. May we remember the role women played in protecting many of our societies. As we grapple with how to center women in the project and agenda of peace and security, may we draw on our history. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our First Lady. As author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie demands of all of us, we should all be feminists. Our keynote speaker, Her Excellency, Madam Monica Gengos, the First Lady of Namibia, who is both a lawyer by profession and a brilliant businesswoman, has heeded Adichie's plea. And this she has done through her constant drive towards the upliftment of women and children. One of the many projects that her office focuses on is the Break Free Anti-Violence campaign, which aims at fighting against gender-based violence. She collaborated with the One campaign to fight against gender-based violence. Together with One, the First Lady brought together more than 60 journalists, news organizations, the police, social workers, and civil society from across Southern Africa to explore the best practice when it comes to the reporting of gender-based violence incidences. A very, very important undertaking, considering how sometimes problematic it is the ways in which issues around gender-based violence are reported in our media. This is one of the many campaigns that Her Excellency, Madam Gengos, has been part of in her quest towards the protection of women and girls. And in 2020, she was recognized by Avance Media as one of Africa's most influential women. As First Lady, Mrs. Gengos has combined her high-level corporate expertise with President Gengos' war on poverty and inequality. Through her One Economy Foundation, the First Lady has initiated numerous programs that focus on sustainably lifting vulnerable populations out of poverty traps. In this regard, a flagship project, the #BeFree movement, occupies most of her time. She's very passionate about young people and women. This youth-driven program facilitates a non-governmental platform, a non-judgmental platform for adolescents and young adults to freely discuss their challenges while assisting them with access to information and appropriate services. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Gengos is currently overseeing the institutionalization of the Be Free key learnings into project #BeFree by constructing an inclusive one-stop youth center of excellence. And just before I call her, I also just want to highlight that she was honored with the International World Without AIDS Award for her advocacy work in the fight against AIDS. She was awarded the annual Concordia Leadership Award for her global leadership and unique and powerful efforts to lead the way for health and socio-economic empowerment. Various international organizations and publications have ranked Mrs. Gengos as one of the 100 most reputable Africans and one of the 100 most influential African women. How lucky are we? Mrs. Gengos is a recognized leader whose forthright speaking, as the VC has indicated, has made her a sought-after speaker, featured in prominent global publications and international news network. Her bio is very long. I know I did not do justice to it, but I wanted to highlight some of the points which are most relevant to the kind of theme that we're also having tonight, Madam. We are truly honored to have you as our keynote speaker tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Her Excellency, Madam Monica Gengos.
Please sit down. If you want a visual representation of my speech, then you must just recall the play that was done here because it's as if you had my speech with you. So thank you very much. So if you don't hear anything I said, go back and play the video of that play. Program Director, Mr. Eusebius Mkhize, Your Excellency, Dr. Thabo Mbeki, former President of the Republic of South Africa, Mr. J. Maboa, Chairperson of the University Council, and other council members present, Professor Puleng Lenkabuli, Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, and other members of the University Executive, and extended members present, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors and High Commissioners representing various countries in South Africa, and representatives of the Namibian Embassy to South Africa, Mr. Important Kize, Chairperson of the Luthuli Museum, Council and other members of the Luthuli Museum, Dr. David Masondo, Deputy Minister of Finance, Mrs. Tembi Kadimeng, Deputy Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and other members from various government departments, Dr. Bam, the former chairperson of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Mr. Kuleko Luthuli, and other members of the Chief Albert Luthuli family present here tonight, dignitaries from the national, provincial, and local government, Professor Puleng Sekgalo, chairperson of the UNISA, Chief Albert Luthuli's research chair, who came to fetch me from the airport yesterday and really energized me with her energy. The panel discussants, representatives from other institutions of higher learning, of course, the young people who had that fantastic play that I was so impressed with, alumni, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. It's such an honor to be here, and I'd like to begin my lecture with how Chief Luthuli began his 1961 acceptance speech for his Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. And I quote, "On an occasion like this, words fail one. This is the most important occasion not only in my life, but in that of my dear wife, Nokukanya, who shares with me this honor. Her encouragement, not just her mere encouragement, but active support, made me at times fear that she herself might end in jail one day. She richly shares with me this honor." Close quote. My words also fail in expressing how deeply honored I feel to have been asked by UNISA to give this year's Chief Albert Luthuli lecture. I want to take this moment to recognize the memory of Ma Nokukanya and her meaningful contribution that enabled Chief Albert Luthuli to be the consequential leader he was. Many women sacrifice their careers to support their husband's work and expect no acknowledgement. It is perhaps because we have been socialized to normalize society's demand that women perform unpaid labor, whether they are formally employed or not. The Luthuli couple were clearly not operating according to societal expectations. I'm sorry, you know, technology is supposed to help, but it doesn't always. They operated according to a shared value of partnership and the sanctity of family. If we are tempted to believe that Luthuli was a man ahead of his time, or that his views on women empowerment were anomalous to African culture, it is illuminating to read his views in his book titled Let My People Go, where he states, and I quote, "Our women have never been treated by us as inferiors. It is the whites, misunderstanding the laws and customs by which we formerly governed ourselves, who have done this. Having no ready-made laws in their own society to meet the needs of ours, they've declared that our women are legally minors throughout their lives. This does not reflect." I'm going to get irritated with this thing very quickly. I apologize for this. This does not reflect the situation as seen through African eyes, and it has done great injury to the position occupied by African women. Close quote. The gravity of the statement articulated by a teacher, a traditional leader, and a President General of the ANC, should give us pause. Nkosi Luthuli practiced what he preached. There was no gap between what he spoke of in the public realm and what he did in private. Presently, in 2022, there's a generation of women whose empowerment and success complicates the power dynamics of their relationships at home, at work, and in social settings. They are told they are too ambitious, too intimidating, too un-African. They are not humble enough. They are too loud, and of course, they should remember their place. In 1962, Chief Luthuli was telling us the opposite. He was telling us as women, you belong, your contributions matter, and you are worthy. It is also clear that Nkosi Luthuli valued his wife and honored her by recognizing her influence, activism, and leadership. As the spouse of a powerful leader, I appreciate that posture. Powerful men, in whatever context, are often complex. This is true whether it's a pastor, a police officer, or a politician. Men who have influence over others are not easy people. Not all of them know how to wield their power appropriately. Their wives often do more emotional and unpaid labor than what they are recognized for. And to see the recognition of Mano Kunkanya from her husband gives hope to the thousands of supportive wives who remain unseen, unrecognized, and undervalued by society and sometimes by their partners. It is perhaps not that Nkosi Luthuli was ahead of his time. It appears that 60 years later, and stripped of our values by a brutal system that dehumanized us, it is perhaps us who have fallen behind the times and find ourselves incapable of recognizing each other's humanity. The need to include women at all levels goes beyond speeches and action plans. We must believe it. We must live it. There are men who read eloquent speeches about gender equality while mistreating spouses at home and undermining female colleagues at work. The true gauge of gender equality is basic respect and recognition of the other. Hard indicators like women's representation are important, but soft indicators like the way women are spoken to, the way women are spoken about, and the way we treat women really tells us a lot about individuals or an institution and what they think about that woman. Patriarchy kills. It kills dreams, it kills hopes, it kills people. Societal rules that uphold a belief that men are superior to women are reflective of a society that is not at peace with itself. According to Africa Check, out of the 6,083 people killed in South Africa in the fourth quarter of 2021/2022, 898 were women and 4,879 were men. This works out to an average of 2 women and 13 men murdered per day in South Africa. The assault figures look similar, where male-on-male violence is significantly more prevalent than male-on-female violence. According to the Suicide Worldwide 2019 report, the WHO estimates that out of 13,744 suicides in South Africa, 2,913 were women, and 10,861 were men. In essence, of all suicides in South Africa per 100,000 people, 37.6 are men and 9.8 are women. In comparison, the global age-standardized suicide rate is higher in males at 12.6 per 100,000. Remember, in South Africa, it's 37.6 relative to a global average of 12.6. In men, and 5.4 per 100,000 in women. South African women, 9.8. Which shows the stark difference between global suicide rates and South African suicide rates. But similar to other countries, South African men are killing each other and themselves at significantly higher rates than women. It is not only women who are afraid of men. The statistics tell us that men have good reason to be afraid of each other. And yes, not all men. I say this as the nitpickers love to yell, not all men, in order to play games of distraction on a profoundly serious issue. There is an imperative to redefine male identity in the post-conflict era. Former President Thabo Mbeki has been consistent in exhorting a definition of Pan-African identity that extends itself beyond national borders. And I quote, "I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the desert, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. My body has frozen in our frosts and in our latter-day snows. It has thawed in the warmth of our sunshine and melted in the heat of the midday sun. The crack and rumble of the summer thunders, lashed by startling lightning, have been a cause both of a trembling and of hope." Close quote. Like many Africans, I read that speech more than once. President Mbeki spoke of an African renaissance, which gave us all hope. We appreciated the eloquent use of words, but also reconstructed the metaphoric meaning of his descriptions to contextualize our own situations in our own countries. Most importantly, we recognize the importance of the narrative he was trying to redefine all of us with. As we look to reconstruct a narrative around African masculinity, we must be truthful, but we must also be mindful of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Men are not the problem. They have a problem, which places them and all of us at risk. And to solve this problem, we need to redefine who we are. The African Union has created what they call a circle of champions, comprised of heads of state who are engaged in shaping positive masculinity that disavows gender-based violence. And this is highly commendable. While Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is the patron of the initiative and provides much-needed leadership and guidance, the 15 heads of state who are part of the Positive Masculinity Initiative are all men. And this shouldn't surprise us. Firstly, because the most compelling voices for redefining male identity are male voices, particularly the powerful and persuasive voices of heads of state. The second reason for the Boys Club is because there is only one female head of state at African Union level, which makes a strong case for the inclusion of women at all levels. According to the African Union, and I quote, "Positive masculinity has been found to be crucial to ending all forms of violence against women and girls, and provides a critical lens through which to reshape masculinities in ways that promote healthy, peaceful, individual and social well-being for all. This is a key intervention that will shape future generations for the better. However, we are faced with the urgency of now. What do we do with the prevailing circumstances that are harmful, as we had earlier said, to both men and women? We've been socialized to accept patriarchy as the norm, even though the statistics show that patriarchy is harmful to everyone, including men, perhaps especially for men. If it is not working, why does patriarchy have so many defenders? Why is there a pushback against gender equality? What does the pushback seek to achieve, and what does it say about the things we value? When I think of defining ourselves beyond our borders, I think of Nkosi Luthuli, who was born in Zimbabwe and did not confine his identity to his tribe or country. In a way, he reminds me of the late Herman Andimba Toivo, a Namibian who was jailed on Robben Island for 16 years. A man who Nelson Mandela described in his autobiography as a formidable freedom fighter, and noted a story of how during a hunger strike on Robben Island, the Namibian prisoners were being beaten up by the warders. Yatoivo, ever stubborn, hit back and knocked down one of the warders, as he never saw himself inferior or superior to anyone. Yatoivo was subjected to repeated torture, detention, and intimidation. And during his trial, and imagine he's about to be sentenced, and during his trial, he said that, and I quote, "Only when our human dignity is restored to us as equals of the whites will there be peace between us," close quote. Yatoivo's convictions were so strong that unclassified intelligence files of the apartheid regime bear the frustration that they had regarding his unbreakable spirit. And I quote, "Yatoivo has since his incarceration not relented his anti-white point of view. He is surly, moody, and shows no respect or cooperation. He refuses to communicate with any official, and his general behavior is poor. He does not submit to any authority and is unsatisfied to be held in a South African prison. His general prognosis can be described as bad, and there is no question about any form of rehabilitation," close quote. Yatoivo was not praised by his foes. He was, however, loved, respected by his comrades and friends from across the world, including white people. Yatoivo didn't have a problem with white people. He had a problem with apartheid, which they conveniently ignored. Yatoivo was a man of truth and firm principles. He stood in favor of gender equality, non-racialism, and spoke vehemently against corruption. Yatoivo had another similarity with Nkosi Luthuli. He was a family man who respected and valued his wife, Meme Vicky Yatoivo, and he was also the driving force behind the Ovambo People's Congress, the forerunner to the current ruling party in Namibia called SWAPO. Yatoivo was a leader who never felt entitled to position. After independence, when political machinations moved as they do, Yatoivo found himself outside of party leadership structures. He did not rage against the dying of his political light. He accepted his political fate and retained his status as a revered and wise elder of the party. He also remained true to his principles. He never shied away from telling the truth, speaking his mind, and if necessary, picking up a phone to give a senior party member a piece of his mind. He passed away as he lived, with his integrity intact and his principles uncompromised. Very much like Nkosi Luthuli. Two men who lived for a cause far bigger than themselves. Men who understood the shifting nature of politics and knew how it felt to have the sun shine on you one day and to be in the shade the next day. This is a lesson we can all learn. We are not bigger than the political parties or the countries we represent. We are not entitled to permanent positions or status. When our lights start to dim, as they inevitably will, we must know how and when to make a graceful exit and be remembered for what we stood for. There's an Antonio Gramsci quote that makes me think of former liberation movements that are now ruling parties, but it also makes me think of the state of many countries. It makes me think of the state of the world. And I quote, "The old world is dying, and the new world is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters." Close quote. Our leaders will do well to study the lives of the Yatoivos and the Luthulis and resist the urge to become the monsters who chop public funds and cannibalize their own legacies. Long live the memories of Yatoivo and Luthuli. I can see there's politicians in this room. Gender equality is key to conflict prevention and de-escalation, while creating a critical building block for peace, safety, and security. Peace is a principal global good and a central promise of the UN Charter. When the then Southwest Africa gained her independence from apartheid South Africa in 1990, it was the United Nations that supervised her elections, monitored her peace processes, and midwife the birth of a baby called Namibia through a peacekeeping force called the United Nations Transition Assistance Group, UNTAG. It was also at the United Nations on the 31st of October 2000, during Namibia's presidency of the General Assembly and under her leadership, that the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. This resolution sought to highlight the critical role that women could play in preventing war, building peace, and reconstructing post-conflict societies. Resolution 1325 was preceded by the Windhoek Declaration on mainstreaming gender perspectives in multi-dimensional peace support operations. A global study on the implementation of Resolution 1325 noted the immense progress made, but also highlighted the large gaps still to be filled. The study was particularly critical on the lack of women's participation and lamented that women's participation in efforts remained largely symbolic rather than substantive. This criticism is not confined to women's involvement in peace and security matters. It can be referenced to the attendance of the annual high-level meeting of world leaders at the United Nations. At the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2020, of the 190 speakers, there were 76 heads of state, 50 heads of government, 4 vice presidents, 5 deputy prime ministers, 48 ministers, and 7 heads of delegation. And out of these 190 speakers, around 10% were women. The underrepresentation of women plays itself out in all sectors, including the private sector. We are thus not surprised that even though women and children bear the brunt of conflict, they remain underrepresented in the war rooms that push for conflict and the peace summits that seek de-escalation. Again, we find the gap, the intersection of what we say we will do in terms of ensuring gender equality and what we actually do. The gap between what we say in the public realm and what we do in private and in the workplace. Namibia, as the initiator of Resolution 1325, proposed the establishment of the International Women's Peace Center that would become an institute for excellence for mediation, inclusive peacemaking, and conflict prevention, and to support and ensure women's contributions and influence national, continental, and international commitments. That center has been established in Windhoek under the leadership of our Deputy Prime Minister, Honorable Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah. Within SADC, Namibia has the highest number of women who've served in peacekeeping missions. As a matter of fact, in March 2015, Namibia sent a 100% women's peacekeeping contingent to Sudan's Darfur region to make the point that women's representation is key and should be substantive. Namibia has the 3rd highest representation of female parliamentarians and was the first African country to ratify the Resolution 190 of the International Labour Organization on eliminating violence and harassment in the workplace. It took leadership and political will for Namibia to reduce the gap between multilateral and domestic commitments. Yet despite Namibia's achievements, as it is all over the world, women remain vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. The lesson learned here is that it is easier to change laws than it is to change mindsets. This is the only way to reduce the gap between multilateral obligations, domestic policies, and the lived realities of women and children, particularly in relation to sexual violence. Sexual violence is the one area where mindsets are particularly hard to reform. Whether it's in families, communities, or countries, there is a tendency to cover up sexual abuse and to treat it as a private issue. Sexual violence impacts us all, and those who escape accountability often become repeat abusers as they realize there are no consequences to their conduct. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of war should not surprise us. Rape is about power. When men feel powerless and do not fear consequences, they inflict their trauma on women and children in any way they know how. We talk loudly and proudly about the role of women in the armed wings of our liberation movements, yet we whisper about the sexual violence of the commanders and soldiers towards their female counterparts. There are even some UN peacekeeping forces sent to conflict areas who are celebrated when they return home, but are cursed by the vulnerable they were supposed to protect, who suffered harm at their hands. There are established armies, some who boast to have the most powerful military capabilities in the world, who continue to struggle to change their military culture. They struggle to embrace women in their ranks, and they struggle to protect their female military personnel from sexual violence. If the militaries of the self-proclaimed good guys struggle to see their own female counterparts as humans whose dignity must be respected, how do we expect the so-called bad guys, whoever may be so designated, to conduct themselves any better? If the armies of the good guys refuse to allow their soldiers to be held accountable for their crimes and encourage silence when allegations are raised, what is it that we are saying to women? Where does the political will come from if our policymakers are also perpetrators of gender-based violence? What happens when our commanders, our teachers, our university lecturers, our male relatives, our religious leaders are protected from consequences by our systems and protected by our forced silence? To paraphrase Audre Lorde, our silence does not protect us. It protects our perpetrators. Where there are no consequences, there is impunity. Bad things happen where there is impunity. We know who the rapey commanders during the struggle were. Some of them are still alive. We know who the rapey pastors are. We have heard the whispers. We recognize the body language. And we learn to avert our eyes when we notice that look. That look. I remember walking in the wall with an adolescent girl, probably about 2 years younger than some of the young girls I see here. And she wandered off. Then she came back to me looking stressed, and she took my arm, she took my hand and she squeezed my hand. And I asked her, what's wrong? And she said, Auntie, that security guard was looking at me funny. That look. This girl was too young to understand what that look meant. But she was old enough to know that there is a look that men give that represents danger for adolescent girls and women. We navigate that look, that danger, in our homes, our workplaces, our churches, in public spaces, at schools, at universities. Where there is impunity, there is no safety. Many of us have dropped out of school, failed at university, left work in order to treat the trauma of what happens when that look translates itself into action. We are back at the gap between what we know, what we say, and what we do. We know that as post-conflict societies, we carry so much unhealed trauma. Have we prioritized mental health into our national developmental agendas? Are we surprised when we deal with all the manifestations of a traumatized society? Mind the gap between what we know, what we do, and what we say. We know that women's representation in the security sector has been found to significantly lower charges of misconduct, excessive use of force, and also leads to an increase in the reporting of gender-based violence-related crimes. We say that we want to see a higher representation of women in the security cluster, yet women remain largely excluded from the security sector and its leadership. The work being done by the United Nations, the African Union, and regional clusters like ECOWAS and SADC is commendable, but it's not enough. We need to see a measurable decline in the indicators that speak to the prevalence of violence towards women and children in our societies. We need to see more money channeled to the causes of women, peace, and security. We need to see strong institutions with strong, inclusive leaders that are prepared to hold perpetrators accountable regardless of who they are. As our lives increasingly move online, so does our violence. If women are not safe in physical spaces, we are not safe in digital spaces either. Online violence and misogyny against women relies on impunity and is fueled by the same misogyny and basic disrespect for women that fuels general violence against women. A multi-country study on online violence against women in Southern Africa found that women and children are disproportionately targeted with harassment, stalking, hate speech, and threats to safety. The study found that the most targeted are women and girls who are journalists, politicians, activists, human rights defenders, celebrities, and influencers. The study indicated that women and girls who were not prominent did not escape the misogynistic attacks, humiliation, and harassment. Unfortunately, those who feel powerless have found a new frontier from where they can feel powerful by assailing women under the cover of anonymity with the added comfort that there are significant gaps in the law which makes it hard to hold them accountable. Online violence against women serves as a reminder that the new peace and security challenges like cyber safety, human trafficking, and climate change have emerged and will need continuous impact assessment. The bottom line is that women and children will remain unsafe for as long as we don't invest in the changing of mindsets, the strengthening of institutions within the criminal justice system, and ensuring the inclusion of women at all levels. Nkosi Luthuli's understanding of peace was premised on justice and the inclusion of women. I have no doubt this extended to the inclusion of young people. There needs to be structured intergenerational dialogue. Young people are fed up. They've had enough. Unemployed and in search of their identity. The coups that happened in Mali, Guinea-Conakry, and Burkina Faso were the coups of young people. The coup leaders were all under the age of 40 and all claimed to be fed up with the ruling class. Coups are not the answers. In fact, the rising instability they often cause is often at the expense of women and children. Terrorism, coups, and political instability thrive where there is a lack of hope. It should therefore be no surprise that the fighting forces of terrorists are young people. As family dysfunction crumbles, the already fragile family, it is gangs that offer young people protection, resources, and a sense of belonging. In effect, they take over the function of the family. I often reflect on a speech that the AU chairperson delivered in Chad in 2017. He spoke of how Chadian security forces found out about a new phenomena of young female suicide bombers. They had arrested a young female suicide bomber whose suicide belt had failed to detonate. When she was asked why, her answer was simple. She had been forced into an early marriage that she didn't want, and her handlers convinced her that there was another way to get to heaven. And in heaven, she could choose her own husband. A young woman willing to die so that she could choose her own husband. She wanted to die so she could live. Whether it's risking their lives on the Mediterranean Sea, fighting rival gangs in the Cape Flats, or battling their governments who they feel no longer represent them. We know what young people are willing to die for. What we need to find out is, what do young people want to live for? How do we narrow the gap? How do we reduce the trust deficit between generations? Previous generations have passed their untreated trauma to new generations. How do we protect future generations from our collective trauma? As a continent, as regions, as nations, as communities, as individuals, how do the hopes and dreams of a young person living in nearby Attridgeville differ from the aspirations of a young person in Abidjan? What is it that an adolescent girl in Bloemfontein would hope for that her counterpart in Bamako wouldn't want? Whether it's a young girl in Ituri or Inanda, Mamelodi East or Maiduguri West, Goma or Gao, the simple truth is that geography doesn't matter. What matters is that the structural issues that hold African youth back are similar. What matters is that young people across the continent have the same hopes and dreams. Neither despair nor hopelessness can be contained within borders. When there is conflict driven by this despair, women are disproportionately represented in the harm caused. When there are peace talks, talks of workplace promotions, cabinet discussions on developmental projects, that is when women are disproportionately underrepresented. It is ironic that women are said to belong to the kitchen, but when we see the kitchen cabinets of male leaders, there are never any women to be found. Issues of peace and security, gender equality, and youth inclusion can only be responded to through effective leadership. When we see our politicians campaigning for primaries within their political parties, local, regional, or national elections, these are not the issues they appear concerned about. Some of them tend to be more concerned with attaining power for the sake of it. Power that can be converted into cash. Power not for the sake of the masses, but for the sake of money. Power with no purpose, with no competence, with no compassion, is what we end up with when we don't pay attention to who our leaders are and what they represent. We are surprised when former leaders leave the office and start becoming the biggest critics of systems they failed to reform when they had power. Younger generations are forced to fight battles of people who have had problems with each other since the days of the struggle. We keep quiet and silently pray that some leaders will retire in dignity, as we know whatever they are upset about, whatever they're fighting for, has nothing to do with the betterment of societal problems. Their anger at the systems they were part of building is often about feeling unappreciated after sacrificing their youth. The youth of today are called born frees, but born free of what? Inequality? Unemployment? Crime? The youth of yesteryear fought for freedom and oppression, from oppression, and they were prepared to die for that. The youth of today want more, and they are prepared to die for that. These generations have heard of each other, but they haven't met. A new generation, regarded as ungrateful, is yet to meet and understand the generation it believes is old, entitled, and out of touch. This generational battle plays itself out in our homes, where we are told, "Mommy, you won't understand." Or, "No, Mommy, you don't get it," and things have changed. Within these narratives, we lose an understanding of the past and a connection to the future. We lose the appreciation of the importance of how consequential it would be to have succession planning, orderly succession planning, and an intergenerational mix that is demographically representative and leans more towards younger leaders. Imagine for 1 second the pleasure of being represented by the most talented amongst us. Imagine for a second our political leaders inspiring confidence, trust, and hope. All of this is possible only if we are honest about what we don't want and will no longer accept in our leaders. Whether it is sexual violence or leadership, the issue of accountability is at the center of driving change. We must build the systems, processes, and institutions in our parties and governments that are capable of holding each other accountable to a higher standard. The African Renaissance that our Renaissance man, President Mbeki, so eloquently posited, that made us so proud. Resolving the generational disconnect is possible, as it can be resolved through difficult dialogue and inclusion. For the sake of the youth who do not value peace for its own sake, for the sake of women and children who are expected to suffer in silence, for the sake of men who carry the weight of expectation of what it means to be a so-called real man. There are often more reasonable people than they are unreasonable. In a way, we've allowed the loudest and most unreasonable amongst us to take up more space than what they deserve. When challenged, they behave exactly as you'd expect of an unreasonable person. Excuse me. They unleash the most vile abuse and insults on whoever questions them, as they know the function of insults is to silence. Reasonable people often make a calculation and decide, no, I'm not putting myself through that. There is no time left. The silent, reasonable majority must join the conversation and steer it into a new direction. You can survive insults. You can't survive the breakdown of public trust and public dialogue. In the last paragraph of his Nobel Peace Prize speech, Nkosi Luthuli says, and I quote, "May the day come soon when the people of the world will rouse themselves and together effectively stamp out any threat to peace in whatever quarter of the world it may be found," close quote. May that day come where the reasonable majority rouse themselves and stamp out threats to peace. To their credit, the United Nations, the AU, the regional bodies like ECOWAS and SADC, including the Office of the AU Peace Envoy, Mrs. Benita Diop, and the Africa Women Leaders Network, they've created undeniable momentum in doing more about the women, peace and security agenda. This gives credence to the consensus that a peaceful society is an integrated and inclusive society that protects its most vulnerable and recognizes gender equality as a critical path to peace. We say this knowing that there is pushback to the growing realization of the indivisibility of gender equality and development. We say this knowing that women are getting angrier and more impatient. It was young women's anger at the unrelenting violence against women that flooded the streets in a tide of anger during the total shutdown protests in South Africa and similar shut-it-all-down protests in Namibia. These young activists were not polite. They sang rude songs, danced rude dances, and they talked to politicians in the manner they deemed fit. The activists of yesterday were shocked, including the women who went to the Beijing conference themselves as activists. Why are they singing those rude songs? Why are they so rude? And while I understood the generational mission of these young women, there were elements that made me smile slightly and shake my head. And that was the moment I realized there is a generation of women leaders who also need to heed the call to make space for younger women in whose bellies the fire burns a little stronger. Nkosi Albert Luthuli understood this anger and challenged the mindsets of male leaders. And I quote, "The question which we men who lead the movement and who see the suffering of our women must ask ourselves is this: just how long can our women be expected to keep within bounds their indignation? Close quote. How can it be, 60 years later, we are still asking ourselves this question? How can it be that you expect young women who are sick and tired of being scared to be polite when they articulate their pent-up anger? How long can we expect women to keep within the bounds of their indignation? I would like to pause here to recognize the leadership of both Presidents Hage Geingob and Cyril Ramaphosa, who, when confronted by angry young women, met with them and heard them out. That is leadership. Leadership is also about narrowing the gap between what we hear, what we know, and what we do. This responsibility is not just for individual leaders, it is the responsibility of the entire system. There's undoubtedly been progress, but we have also seen reversals and slow progress, especially on the inclusion of women. According to a UN report, only 28 women out of 193 member states of the United Nations serve as elected heads of state or government. It is clear that while progress has been made, there is still a long distance to cover. The UN report estimates that at the current rate of progress, equal representation in Parliament will not be achieved until 2062. That would be 102 years after Nkosi Luthuli gave us a clear roadmap on the importance of including women. That would be way too long. We don't have that kind of time. It reminds me of one of the accounts that Ma Nokokanya was hardworking and supplemented the family income through farming. The early hours she kept was said to rouse others from their slumber to also wake up and go to work. And they would say, "There goes Mabengo, the fields are calling us." There is a lot of work needed to ensure the peace, safety, and security of women. The fields are calling all of us. There is work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the First Lady. Every single sentence, every theme, every paragraph packed a punch. I'm tempted to summarize, but it would defeat the point of your politics for me to mansplain your excellence. Can we give her another round of applause? How cool was she, young people? Eh? Very cool. I behaved like AMA 2000 today. I watched YouTube clips, and I would encourage you, when you have data, because it's not yet fallen, to just search the First Lady's surname and name and watch more of her interviews. Absolutely astounding. Really, really, really astounding. And like I said, you will get good returns for your patience. I know that you feel that way. And I wish that I had the whole evening as an interlocutor just to speak to you, First Lady, but alas, we move on to the respondents, and I'm going to try and make time up, but without robbing them of an opportunity to also engage meaningfully. So I'm going to just introduce each of them, and after I've done so, I'm going to ask them to come to the stage. We'll have a chat, and I'm also going to give you as the audience a chance to ask questions or to make comments and to be as pithy as possible. And then we'll have the vote of thanks and another opportunity to socialize afterwards. The first person I want to introduce is Professor Fundiswa Kobo, who is from my home province, We've got something in common. I also grew up with a very sort of religious household. Not that it helped much because I'm now agnostic, but my family was very Catholic. Couldn't go to bed without first being told that I need to go and say my prayers, go to the bathroom, and then go and sleep in that order. And Prof. Kobo knows all about that. She grew up being woken up by her grandmother literally at 3 o'clock every morning to say prayers. And it's helped her. She ended up with a PhD in theology. And education was as important. You couldn't skip church because the house was locked on a Sunday during church hours. And so that was her upbringing. But besides that, it did set her up to be immersed as a scholar in absolute, incredible professorial studies and research focusing on Christian spirituality, church history, and missiology. Can we please welcome Prof. Kobo? I'm sure you're worried about my snooping around about your biography. The second person I want to invite, we gossiped about him, Prof. Pulang and I. He is a character, that's safe gossip. And that is Professor Simpiwe Sesanti. Many of you will know Prof. Sesanti, who also does a lot of interviews within the media space, and someone who, just for fun, has 2 PhDs, while some of us are still trying to finish our first, in the Faculty of Education at the University of Western Cape, but also in my area in journalism, well, both my areas, my area of practice as a journalist, and the other area in which he has scholastic interest is in academic philosophy. And I think it's also very important in this conversation that we talk about the masculinities that is the underbelly of the gender violence, and the male voices are important. We perpetrate the violence, but we are absent when the solution space questions are asked. And so I'm very glad that he has put up his hand to be part of this conversation. Can we please welcome him to the stage as well? And then last, and certainly by no means least, is another excellent scholar, Professor Relebohile Moletsane, who is professor and also the John Dube Chair in Rural Education in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And what's particularly interesting about her work, amongst many features, is that it is, as with the social psychology work that Prof. Pulang does, it is work that is immersed in the lives and experiences, the phenomenologies, again, as pretentious academics would say, of young people, which is really important, and also using visual medium intellectually, and that interplay between theory and practice, which I think is really, really important. And I'm delighted to be able to say that we have a year. And I must say, by the way, VC, to your point that you made in your remarks, I went to Rhodes University. I'm proud of my alma mater, but I literally had, throughout high school, not one black teacher. All my teachers were white. And at Rhodes University, I think I briefly encountered in customary law Professor Mqeke, but besides that, no person of color had taught me. And almost every one of the people you've heard today are excellent black academics, great for their alma maters, and many of them from UNISA. Can we please, therefore, also invite Professor Moletsane to the stage? So, I'm going to give each of you a chance to react. A lot has happened. You've got prepared remarks, but I'm going to ask you not to speechify and to just trust your excellence and to speak dynamically. I'll have a question. You can ignore that question. I am I don't know why, have a reputation for being chachrach. So I might ask you a provocative question. But I also want you to just spend a couple of minutes reacting to what you've heard from the First Lady and infuse it with just the top line messages that you had prepared. And I want to start with you, Prof. Korbo. Sometimes narrative bios are pretty boring. Yours is actually quite cool. And there's a sentence in there that I actually want to write about. A couple of sentences. One of the things in your bio says, she posits that like race and class, patriarchal violence is equally a fragmenting evil for comprehensive liberation of black humanity. Now you might need a dictionary for the key word here, but I'll explain it. Especially its tendency to elude black male theologians. Now again, elude, you say, if you want people to think you are clever. All it really means is when you want to avoid talking about problematic black people in theology. Now, the reason that sentence stuck with me is that many of the speakers today, and even in an opinion piece, Prof. Puleng, that you co-wrote, try to reinvent Chief Albert Luthuli and come back to that quote. It's white people who turned black women into the status of minorities. And I'm sitting there, even as a queer black man who thinks he's an ally to black women, but knows that even I'm problematic as a queer black man, and I think, how? I wonder whether the beginning and the end of my own problematic patriarchy as a black man is really the colonialist, or whether we should be a little bit tougher on black masculinities and call ourselves out and not just try and psychologize white people who came here and really ask the question, how much of a feminist and how much of an ally was Chief Albert Luthuli, President Mbeki, or Eusebius McKaiser?
Thank you so much, and good evening, friends, all protocol observed. I think you've been very snoopy. I was so shocked when I was listening to how you came across as someone who really knew me, the things that you were saying. But I think if I perhaps begin by responding to exactly what you are pointing to, this, the intersection that I point to of race, class, and sexism. I think the point that I think a lot about, and I think it comes out a lot of in my work, is that well, it is very easy for black men to be angry at racists. When they feel that they are oppressed by white men, you see the level of anger. But then when it comes to how they in turn become oppressors to their fellow women, it becomes, there's a lot of justifications. For instance, let me just mention one key black theologian, James Cone, who's the father of black theology. In his works, he talks about how even when he conceptualized black theology of liberation, his focus was more on the fact that we are oppressed as blacks. And then at that time, he says, the cries of their fellow sisters, which is in this case sexism, well, it never came across as an issue because they understood feminism to be a Western concept. So it was very easy to dismiss it because they understood that feminists are just white women who are just bored in their homes. They have lots of time to interrogate patriarchy and all these systems. So what I try to do in my scholarship, which is why I say I'm a womanist, not a feminist, perhaps firstly is just to move from that understanding that it is a Western concept, because the issue is the oppression of women is a reality. And also, now if you look at the hierarchy, when we talk about black woman, it is someone who's at the bottom of the ladder, of the ladder of everything. Because then you would have your white men, your white women, your black men, and then you will have a black woman. So in a sense, black women, they struggle with all these other layers. Before they could even begin to talk about anything else, there's race, which is an issue for them. There's class, which is an issue for them, because most cases women are poor because they do not have the financial or economic liberation, even though there are a few who have. But if you look at the statistics, you will find that most women are still poor, are still unemployed, and so forth. So that's just briefly how I would respond to your question, how I see this intersection. It is because I think, that's why also I never actually in my own writing separate sexism and racism. I always put a slash, sexism / racism, because I also feel on the other side, how we react and how we respond to racism, whether it's the country, whether it's faith communities, the rigidity of racism, it is the same rigidity that you find in sexism. But then I always feel it becomes worse in sexism because then you are betrayed by your fellow brother, your fellow black brother. So I think I can stop there.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Prof. Sasanti, I don't have a prompt question for you. What is in your thought bubble at this time? I think it should be on, or otherwise just borrow.
Okay, thank you very
between-
much. Let me quickly begin by saying that, recalling the words of Amy Cizé, who said that the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And having said that, recall what has been said by the speakers who came here. All of them kept on saying that Dr. Luthuli said that, we are not responsible for this. It is the white people who are, which suggests, therefore, that his thinking was that our ancestors consciously taught their children that women were supposed to be respected. And so, having said that and recalled Amy Cizé, we then also begin to recall that these white people, when they came here, the first thing they told us was that there was a God, and that this God created white people, and that these white people were superior, and that black people were inferior. So black people were a child race, and white people were the adult race. It was the very same people who told us that there is this God who is a male. This God who is a male had a son who is another male. And that, the reason that we have sin in the world is through the woman. The fact that women give birth and that there is pain that they give birth is a punishment from that God. And later, this man, who's Paul, reminds us that we must remember that, women were created for men, not the other way around. And therefore tells us, that, men have got rights over the bodies of women. And that it tells us that, the man, like the adult gender, must love the women as the child gender. And that this child gender must obey and be obedient to this child gender. So, it is therefore no accident of history that men, irrespective whether they are comrades in the ANC, the PAC, or the BCM, despite the fact that they've been told that people are supposed to be equal, but because they've been inculcated in their minds that they are the adult gender and that they are entitled to the power that they have, and therefore deep, deep in their minds. And Cizé tells us that once you have that psychological orientation, you can see things differently. And women as well have accepted that. You know, despite the fact that they say we do not question the fact that men are the heads of the households, all that we are asking is that they must treat us fairly and include us, as if men have the right to hold the keys to the gate. And so, if you young women are to get it right, you must question those very doctrines. You must interrogate them. And you must know, I heard you singing earlier on here, saying that these people, but here I'm telling you that in our culture that you were citing, when these boys go to the bush and become men, their households are built by women. And when they build those households, amapembe, they are built in the shape of a woman's womb. They go in there to be reborn, because the first home of all human beings, our ancestors taught us, is the women's womb. And that when they go into those houses and come back with the blood covered, it is a representation of how they come out of that blood, of that womb with blood. And they are reborn through women. Because, as I conclude, our ancestors taught us that the link between God and humanity, the link between our ancestors and the living generation, is the woman. Because it is the women alone who give birth. It is the women alone who, in fact, know who the real parents are. The reason that these men feel insecure is that in the first place, they are not even sure that they are the fathers of these children. That's why they rape them. They rape these little girls because they have no feeling. They are uncertain that is their children, because they reduce fatherhood to biology.
Professor Moletsane, I was thinking about your work with survivors of sexual violence who are teenage girls, especially in rural areas, when the First Lady told that very moving story of a young person who knows the look, can't articulate it, but to quote from Jonathan Janssen's book title, it's knowledge in the blood. It's intuitive knowledge that you have. Where are you at in this conversation right now?
So, like a good academic, you must know that I prepared a speech, which I'm not going to use, it seems. But in order to answer that question, I want to start with something the First Lady said around silence and silencing. My work with rural girls and young women is mostly around how they are silenced and how the systems of oppression in rural schools, in rural communities, in rural families keep up that silences, support that silencing of girls and women in the community. So this silencing, for example, in one of the projects, my work is around unearthing or excavating the silences around sexual violence in these communities. So one of the stories, to make an example, was around a young girl who was raped by a neighbor. And part of the silencing is that culturally, the neighbor paid a goat to the family of the girl, not to the girl, to the father of the girl. It was the girl who was raped, it is the father who gets the goat. And so in talking with this group of young girls, this particular girl said, I felt like nothing. I felt like I didn't exist in my father's eyes, that he would accept a goat in exchange for my rape. That's one thing. The second thing I want to link it to, First Lady, is how we hold each other accountable and how we hold our leaders accountable or not. And what you said about rewriting the histories of our heroes. When I felt a little bit brave in the last few years, I ventured into our most supreme hero, Nelson Mandela. And I was intrigued by the fact that we all know that Mandela was not ever silent. But there are a few instances where he was silent, when he should have spoken. And I was intrigued by these significant instances of his silence. And indeed, I reflected on why I thought he was silent. Using silence as a hidden curriculum, maybe, to communicate by not communicating. Using silence as a cultural, I always put that in inverted commas, and using a silence as a very deep, nuanced way of telling us where he stood on this particular thing. So communicating without speaking. So I was very intrigued by that silence and silence.
We've got a couple of microphones. Do I have some angels assisting me? We can get them around. I'll recognize you if you have a question or a comment. Young people as well, I really am delighted that you are not only here, but I watched you the whole time, snooping. And I love how they were hanging on to every single word of all the speakers, including the keynote. So if you guys have questions, please put up your hand and we'll come to you. I ask questions for a living, so I can ask millions of questions, but I want to make this a democratic conversation. So is there anyone, if you do have the mic, if you see someone and I can't see them with a blinding light, just go to them. There's a hand up there towards the middle. If we can get a microphone there, that would be fantastic.
Just bring is that other one?
Okay, and if you do have the mic in your hand, feel free to speak. Just tell us your name and ask a question or make a comment. And then to my panelists, you don't have to answer every question. You can react to whichever comments or questions you are moved by. We'll take a first round.
Sanibonani nonke. And ngithanda ukubingelela everybody who's here ngokwezigaba zethu. Engithanda ukukubuza, okay, igama lami ndinguNozuko, ndikwi Women's Forum as a Deputy Chairperson of Women's Forum, and also I'm a Secretary General of a Black Forum in UNISA. My question and my concern is we've been hearing more about peace and security. A lot of talks have been done. And now my question is, where is implementation of the things that have been proposed by women, things that have been proposed by communities? Because we talk, but we don't do anything. We keep on having events as these, but what is happening thereafter? I'm saying this because who knows, maybe as we speak, there is a woman who feels so unsafe in her own home, at her workspace, in her community. Where is the security? Why are politicians keep on talking but not implementing and enforcing policies? Where are the programs that are going to help men that we think they've got problem in our society, in Africa? What is happening? Why are we always fed with all this information, but no implementation? After everything that have been said, no document that is sent to government to say no to this. As a community, this is what we want. Why do we waste time while people are dying left and right, especially young girls, young boys, and women? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Do we have another comment or question? One this side. It's a safe space. Don't be shy to speak. And then over here after that, can we get a mic in the meantime as well? Is that one working? It's a rare moment where a man is taking a vow of silence.
One, two.
Evening. You'll excuse me, it's not out of disrespect that I don't stand. I'm someone with a disability, so standing is not necessarily a conducive thing for me. I just wanted to, okay, before I get to my question, highlight a little pain at the moment. Oh, Mam Langangale, I saw she let it slide. She is also a fellow comrade in the NISA. I see there on the screen we have our sign language interpreter. And the thing is that imagine you had to listen to something and the volume is on 1. And you know what recently happened with that interpreter in Limpopo. Where the level of the screen is similar to that type of situation for a deaf person. It's literally having the volume at 1 and being expected to understand what is going on. So for me, it's a little pain that I felt I could not let go at the moment. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, about that. But to get to my question, Popko, it's funny that this week I was with you during the conference and we spoke about gender-based violence, issues of, well, there was a question that was really dealt with by Prof. Lerata as well. And I guess for me, it comes to how does patriarchy in society then impact the lack of progression? I'm directing it to you because you'll probably have a better background at the conference that we recently had this week, looking at what was said there.
And then I'll take just 2 here in the front, and then I'll get back to my panel. Let's take 2 young people.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ziyanda Manana. I am from Positive Vibrations Arts Foundation of Hope for the Girls. I've been in this organization for 9 years now, and I'm currently in matric. I am glad I have been one of the many lucky girls in my country and in the world to have found a home that has taught me so much. First, about being a girl and knowing my role and responsibility as I transit into adulthood. I've been lucky also to be in a position to inspire, to be a young leader, to be patriotic, to have a voice, to advocate, to be a student who is consistent in doing well in my studies because of the guidance that has brought me here today. Fortunately, from where I come from, we don't see these opportunities. We don't encounter these opportunities. They are so remote from the realities of our everyday lives. We happen to be the only group that understands the history of Ubabu Luthuli, the history of Mapengu, the history of Impiase Sandlwana, the history of Ubabu Thabo Mbeki, and his contribution to our beloved land. My question is, how can we multiply or establish a way that can reach to a sister of mine who is in the rural areas? The sister of mine who does not have any source of structure, to a sister of mine who currently lives in fear and in sorrow. How can we better realize women and girls' peace and security with so much brutal violence and cruelty amongst girls and women? Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lerato Mukulani, and I'm from Positive Vibrations. I'm also a grade 12 learner. Thank you to all the speakers who spoke so exceptionally well on the account of the key principles, policies, and structures that Inkosi Chief Albert Luthuli valued as a young man, as a teacher, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, a political leader or activist, and foremost, as the first African Nobel laureate. I would like to quote him, open quote, though I speak of Africa as a single entity, it is divided in many ways by race, language, history, by political, economic, and ethnic frontiers. But in truth, despite these multiple divisions, Africa has a single common purpose and this single aim. Our goal is a united Africa in which the standards of life and liberty are constantly expanding, in which the ancient dignity of man is rescued from beneath the hills of colonialism. All Africa both lands which have won their political battles but still have to overcome their legacy of economic backwardness. Close quote. My question is, I want to establish a sense of how we can absorb the energy of his values, the energy of his policies in ensuring that women and families, women and communities are emancipated. How women in societies enjoy such an environment that secures and put forward their intelligence, their talents, their innovative ability, and as much as their natural instincts in being a woman. How can men find a synergy that collaborates a way of working together with no intimidation and discrimination? Thank you.
Wow, these are such brilliant interventions. Thank you so much to everyone. We'll go in reverse order, and I will ask my panelists to do two things. React to any question or comment that you feel you want to. And then after that, supplement it and take your time. You can go back to your old school speech, Prof. Take your time, and then also take the opportunity to summate with concluding thoughts, including some of the headline ideas that you came to this event with. We'll go in reverse order. We'll start with you, and you can react to anything. I'm still on that absolutely amazing question from Ziyanda that goes to the heart of your work. How do we multiply her excellence to reach her rural sisters?
Indeed. So, Ziyanda, my work is totally in rural communities. I always joke that I get the university to pay me to work in the rural areas, not at the university. So my principle is taking the university to the people. And so I'm one person, granted, but I believe that reaching one community at a time counts for something. And many of the students that I've trained so far also starting projects in those unreachable areas of what we like to call the rurals. So we're beginning to address your concern. I wanted to respond to the question that came from this stage about why are we not seeing any change? In South Africa since 1994, we've been very vocal about gender equality, and indeed across the the continent of Africa. I believe that our response has been rather problematically gendered. And instead of addressing the very gender norms that the First Lady talked about, our responses have instead tended to perpetuate those unequal gender norms. So, for example, we can count since the early 90s how many women's conferences we have had on the continent. I wrote them down because I didn't want to forget. We had the 1999 Zanzibar Conference on Women of Africa for a Culture of Peace. We had the Kampala Action on Women and Peace in 1993, the African Platform for Action in Dakar, and I could go on and go on. So my analysis, and it might be faulty, you might disagree with me, is that despite the evidence that suggesting that these strategies are not working, we continue doing the same things. I wonder why we believe that a gendered perspective means that we need an African Women's Conference, for example, on peace. Who are we talking to? What are we changing by talking amongst women, to women, by women? So that is just my, my little analysis there. Just to conclude, I took the First Lady's talk as a call to action. And there have been many calls for action. But I haven't quite been moved by a call to action like I have been moved today. Because I think that the First Lady and the young women really touched on our personhood as African people. When are we going to redefine who we are in ways that will change the way we relate to each other and the way that will change the way we treat our children, particularly girls? Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Professor Santi.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, I would like to say that...
Just hold the mic up a little bit.
Yeah. At the time when the former president of this country was 2 years old, I think. He was only 2 years old. At that time, he was 1948, he was 6 years old. He was born in 1942. So he was 6 years old. When he said, I doubt, I began to doubt myself. And I got the mathematics right.
That's how you get 2 PhDs.
In 1948,
you read those Chappies papers, did you know?
Sheikh Anta Diop said, raised the question and said, when do we begin to speak about an African Renaissance? His response, amongst many things, he said that unless and until we begin to have a conversation amongst ourselves in our own African languages, we shall not get anywhere, because Sheikh Anta Diop understood that it was quite a minority who spoke English and spoke French and spoke Portuguese. And that when you begin to speak in African people's languages, you are going to be speaking to the masses of the people. The question that you are raising, that, you see, the first thing that what they have done to us, the so-called educated, is that, as Frantz Fanon said, he said that the most, amongst the Negroes, you can never find people who have got the most inferiority complex more than the educated people. Those are the ones who have got the most inferiority complex. And Fanon said that how will you recognize it? You will recognize it by them speaking bombastic terms, by them wearing suits and ties, and all of that wanting to be white and looking like white people, right? And so you've got to liberate ourselves from that. But then Sheikh Anta Diop said that one of the key things that we must understand is that we must study the history of Kemet, not so much because Kemet is better than the rest of the continent, but because that there is a written record. And that written record indicates to us that our ancestors taught that God is neither male nor female, that God is male and female. And that's why when you pray, you must become rebellious. I'm asking you to be rebellious in the footsteps of Thabo Mbeki, who said that for the African Renaissance, we must be rebellious. You must begin to say, our mother who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, her kingdom come. Because God is neither male nor female, God is both male and female. And it is for this reason that our king, the king of Sandwan, give me Kachwai, when he was captured in England, and these white people said to him, you must stand up, and he said, no, I bow to no one except my queen mother, and that is Ngombas. And there was a law in KwaZulu that said that you may have committed whatever murder. If you ran to the grave of that woman, then you would be spared. This shows then the centrality of women in our culture. So what you then do, young people, is that for you to be able to overthrow this system of patriarchy and to reverse the oppression of these males, they always invoke a culture that is distorted, that support patriarchy, that has got nothing to do with our culture at all. It is a culture that has been distorted the same way as everything else is distorted. So when you begin to revisit the real history of the African people, that is going to tell you that amongst the laws of the Abantu, as Credo Mutwa said, was that the prioritized being is first the mother, then follows the father. The woman comes first, and then the man. It is in our culture. And that has got nothing to do with oppressing women. And when, some people talk about women needing to be protected, you must point out just that the same way that the first home of a human being is the womb, the first protector of all human beings. Never mind that men in their ignorance and arrogance don't recognize this. The first protector of all human beings is the woman. By carrying that child for 9 months, by sleeping down in a particular position, by breastfeeding to an extent that she develops sores on her breast, by feeling pain for some time before she can walk properly. It is because of these things that are not taught to males that they don't understand. When we went to the bush to be circumcised, what we were being taught, young woman, was that we had also to be patient. That thing was distorted where we went. And they told our young men that when you get out, you must look for a woman that you can sleep with and mess around with before you marry a woman that is of quality. That was distortion. It is for this reason that these males are arrogant as they are. Because instead of being educated in the cultural schools, they are being miseducated. Everything has been turned upside down. But the Ohafia, and I'm concluding, the Ohafia have a status in their language. They say a man's penis scatters. It literally scatters everything. A man's penis scatters, but a woman's womb gathers. We see it literally, that through their deadly weapons, which are the penises, the men are destroying. But it is always the women who must gather everything together. Because the story of creation tells you, according to the African people, that it is the males who brought wrong into the world. And it was the women who had to rescue the situation. That's summarized in the philosophy of our ancestors called Ma'at.
Thank you, Prof. And last but not least, Prof. Kobo.
Thank you so much. I think to respond to the question of patriarchy, Her Excellence, I think, has made a very bold statement that patriarchy kills. She says patriarchy kills, and then she moves further to say it kills even man. I think what that really came out for me, because I think firstly, just generally, how patriarchy sometimes is just reduced or understood to be, when it is just the fact that, for instance, I'm a woman who's a professional, so you would find extremists and fundamentalists talking about patriarchy in a sense that, or reminding me of my place, that, but you have to cook. So there are people, there's a sense in which people just reduce sometimes patriarchy to the roles, whether you cook or whether you clean or whether you do such things. But I think what I get from Her Majesty is how it is, this is a system that I believe is very deeply entrenched in our society, that makes us believe that it is boys who are inferior. If you look at how, even mostly in our own cultures, how the location or the place of the boy has always been a prominent one, the heirs, and how women are taught at a young age to behave in a certain way because one day they will have to be wives to husbands and so forth. It starts just those small things. But then also, I think sometimes how as society we, perhaps the focus in most instances on a girl child in terms of the transferring and training of values as to how to be a human, and how boy children often are not given that attention or perhaps teaching so that they understand also their role in society, not only as heirs, as they're trained to be, not only as the leaders, as they're trained to be. And unfortunately, if then I bring in the whole space of religion, which is where I come from, that's where also this whole issue of patriarchy becomes a problem, because then there'll be this use of scriptures to justify why a woman must be silent. But I always say in response to that, people who often do that, they are very selective in their reading of the Bible, because then they would identify verses that silence women. They would never go to Jesus when Jesus said there is neither male nor female. So I always look at how even in our own context, in faith communities and even in church, also we tend to believe. I think Her Majesty spoke about belief because she spoke about how we should not just put these things in policies and so on. There's a sense in which we need to believe that women are important and their role in society. And I think I agree with you so much, but then again, the issue of belief is how sometimes we as women, we have believed that we're inferior, and how we have believed that we are second citizens in society. So the question of the impact of patriarchy in society. Well, if a black woman is oppressed, I think by default a black man is oppressed even if he is not aware. Because I believe that the liberation if we are going to talk about the liberation of a community, our black communities or African communities, there is no liberation of African communities without women. There is no justice without women. There is no peace without women. There is no security without women. So there's a sense in which I believe that that statement about patriarchy kills even for men is not stressed enough, because then men don't see themselves as victims of this poisonous system, which makes people believe that a woman belongs there and a man belongs there. So patriarchy kills. It is a serious challenge for our societies because it makes people to believe, and I think Uprof speaks about this because she keeps on pointing to mother, she keeps on pointing to the womb, and how in some instances when young boys are brought up to believe that they'll be heirs, how they intend to disrespect even their mothers because of this kind of system that has been created. So whenever I talk about this, perhaps we do not understand that when I say sometimes the issue is not men, when we do not really understand the depth of the system, that it actually affects us as women, but even men, even if they're not conscious of how deadly patriarchy is. So patriarchy is a problem. Patriarchy kills, patriarchy, it silences, patriarchy does all sorts of things. And I think also, I think when I was listening to Her Majesty, and also I think when I was thinking about the theme, it is easy perhaps to ask or to even make statements like, women take your places, women lead, women be involved in this and that. But when we fail to look at the system, because patriarchy, you can put a woman in power like any day, tomorrow and any other day, but the resistance that comes, how then you see how it intensifies when actually women are in these roles, when women are in power, how then firstly males gang up on these women who are in power, and how also at some instances women gang up against women in power. So I think that's how I would want to react on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very powerful. I'm going to draw it to a close, and I want to, just before we give them a round of applause, affirm and thank my three respondents in very specific ways, and there's complexity that I can't summarize. Prof. Kobo, thank you for your work that you do. You describe your work correctly so as being about, quote, the liberation of fragmented black humanity. And that's exactly what it is, recovering our humanity. Thank you for taking up the mantle in the academy of making sure that theory intersects with our actual lives. When we talk about fragmented black humanity, we're not just writing papers, we're talking about our experiences in homes, in the community. So thank you for that. I want to thank you, Prof. Moletsane, for getting the university to pay you to go to the community. And that's exactly what we should be doing, rather than the university being an abstraction away from social reality. And then lastly, Professor Santi, thank you for the cross-disciplinary work. Our universities have this weird idea that you are a psychologist for life, a Journ lecturer for life, a philosopher for life, and you eschew that by making sure that your work speaks across those disciplines, because we don't live single narrative lives. And thank you for being part of this conversation, even though it was in English. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you so much on behalf of the university. I'm going to call the VP in a second, but just from my side as a moderator, it's been a long evening. I gave Prof. Puleng a tough time for the program being so long, as someone who does eventing a lot. But I must say it was worth it, politically, intellectually. Every single moment was amazing. And I'm glad there's a recording, we can go back to it. I want to affirm the great questions we had, the challenge, the calling out of ableism, which I think is really very important. And I could spend an hour meditating on what was beautiful, First Lady, about everything that you had said, whether it was about the banality of patriarchy, men being scared of men. I am a burly black man, and I'm scared of other black men. And that alone is a deep conversation to be had. Many of the speakers spoke about gendered stereotypes, and I think back to that powerful, you must go and check it out, folks, powerful Global Citizen 5-minute set of remarks that you made online about gendered stereotypes and insults. And what I love about the First Lady is that she speaks plainly. No bombastic words. She gets to the truth in simple English. She talks as a woman in a high position who's been slut-shamed, who's been fat-shamed, who's gone through all of these things. And that is the power that she carries with her and that we saw here as well. Can we please give her another round of applause? With that said, that's it from me. The final person you will hear from this evening is Professor Zodwa Motsa, who is in charge at UNISA of teaching, learning, community engagement, and student support. Can we please welcome Prof to do the vote of thanks?
Thank you, Program Director. Let me first introduce myself very briefly, because you just have to get my spirit, knowing very well that you perhaps are not able to see me. I'm born of a great woman. I'm born of a chief on the side of my father and a king on the side of my mother, uMadlamini. I'm a princess, actually, despite the fact that I've opted to do this job of teaching. Your Excellency, former President of the Republic of South Africa, I wish to introduce you to Inkosi Luthuli, whom I should have started with in terms of protocol. You shall recall, Your Excellency, that the British Traditional Convention of Decorum talks about the aristocratic pecking order. I'm not going to follow that. I'm going to follow a notion that was introduced to me some years ago by Ali Mazrui, with whom I was sharing a stage, a notion of aristocratic pecking order as a way of protocol. This is why I started with you. On behalf of the University of South Africa, we wish to thank you. We wish to thank you and the galaxy of those around you, ministers, deputy ministers, and your entourage, and especially Alan, my friend. Madam Vice Chancellor, thank you very much for hosting this August event. We cannot thank you enough for hoisting the flag of discourse for change in our university. We need this, we need more of this, because we're able to breathe. To the keynote speaker, Your Excellency, I won't say anything because so much has been said by the discussants. It would only extend the night to be much longer than it is. It was a sterling presentation. I still owe myself more time to go back to listen to that. As a university, we are very, very honored to have you, and we truly appreciate your submission on these issues that are so thorny, so difficult to handle, and yet so close to us. The family of Inkosi Luthuli, thank you for sharing him with us. It is very difficult, I know, to do this, but you have been very generous and you have shared him with us. As a university, we are very grateful for that. I wish to say that sometimes in our discourse, we forget people that matter. I wish to thank this group of actors that took me back to my student years, the Positive Vibrations Foundation. Come back. We want to see more of that, but not tonight. We truly are blessed to have your rendition. I wish to thank the council of this university that sits in the edges of everything that we do, but affirms us as a university and applauds us whenever we do right. It gives us courage as a university, and I really wish to thank members of council, both here and also attending virtually. I wish to say that we are happy to have such support from our council. The UNISA community, thank you. Thank you very much. I know you grace these occasions in many ways, and you do it so selflessly. You provide the ideas, you provide the support. You organize these events in many ways. Many sleepless nights have been spent in organizing this event. We really wish to thank you from the bottom of our heart on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor. May I end with this note that all of you individually, collectively, we are grateful for your presence here. This is why I want to gird this with the notion of the aristocratic label, because in Africa, there is no orphan. In Africa, there is no distant cousin. We all count. In short, ladies and gentlemen, do you speak Siswati? Do you speak Siswati? Okay. In short, ladies and gentlemen, ngifuna ukuthi siyabonga kakhulu kuba khona kwenu njengemkhandlu weYunivesi sithi ningadzinwa nangemuso. Your Excellency President Mbeki, I was saying we thank. I know he understands. He understands my mother tongue. I'm just pulling. We thank everyone here as a university. We're highly honored to have you here. Please come back again. Nangomso siyabonga. Thank you.
I really didn't mean to be the last person to speak. Praat jy Afrikaans? No. I'm one of the 44 that Charlize Theron was referring to. One of the other many cool things I was snooping around about the First Lady, I think it was your first interview with Josie. It was actually a contemporary of mine from the debating circuit. She doesn't like protocol and honorifics. Even being called Your Majesty or First Lady is not something that she takes easily to, which is absolutely fantastic. But some things you have to live with. And one of them is asking all of you to please remain seated whilst the former president and the First Lady vacate first. Thank you so much.